The alarms were screaming before I even opened my eyes. My name is Vesiskar Thal, and I still remember the exact sound of that morning, because it was the sound of everything I believed about the universe beginning to crack apart. I was thrown from my sleeping frame as the listening post shuddered around me, metal groaning like a wounded animal. Red light pulsed through the corridors. Somewhere above me, the hull was taking hits it was never built to survive. I ran for the command deck with my heart hammering against my chest. My commanding officer, an older Aelthani named Celeron, was already there, gripping the edge of the console so hard his knuckles had turned pale. On the main screen, dozens of enemy warships bled out of the dark, like ink spreading through water. Skarn Dominion ships. I had only ever seen them in training simulations. Now they were real, and they were 3 minutes from our position. They found the relay station, Celeran said, his voice tight and controlled in a way that frightened me more than shouting would have. They know exactly where we are. I did not need to ask why the Skarn wanted this post destroyed. We were the last listening station standing between their advancing fleet and 6 unprotected colony worlds. If we fell, there would be no warning for the people living on those worlds. There would just be fire, arriving out of a clear sky. "Signal command," I said. "Tell them we need reinforcements." Celeron did not answer right away. He reached beneath the console and pulled out a small data crystal, one I had never seen before. It was old, scratched, clearly kept somewhere it was not meant to be found easily. "There is no fleet close enough to reach us in time," he said quietly. "Our closest ships are 11 days away. We have perhaps 11 minutes. The station shook again. Somewhere below us, I heard a support strut give way, with a metallic scream that I felt in my teeth. "Then what do we do?" I asked him, and I hated how small my voice sounded. Celeron looked at the crystal in his hand as if it were something dangerous. In a way, I would later understand, it was. "There is an old agreement," he said, "buried in the founding treaties of the Concord, from a time before either of us were born, a mutual defense clause with a species we quarantined generations ago. We were told never to use it unless there was truly nothing left to try." "Who?" I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw real fear in his eyes. "The Terrans," he said. "Humans." I had heard the name before, the way children hear old stories meant to frighten them into behaving. Humans were the species the first Concord scouts had encountered centuries ago and immediately recommended isolating. The reports I had read in academy training described them as unpredictable, aggressive beyond reason, capable of turning any conflict into something far larger and far more costly than it needed to be. We built an entire section of space law around keeping them contained on their side of a boundary none of us wanted to cross. And now Celeran was holding the key to summoning them directly to us. "Sir, if we call them, we do not know what will come through that door," I said. "The old reports say they are more dangerous than the enemy already attacking us." "I know what the reports say," Celeran answered, and he inserted the crystal into the console before I could argue further. "But right now, the enemy already attacking us is real, and the unknown is only a possibility. I would rather face a possibility." Lights I had never seen active flickered to life across an old panel built into the same console. A transmission array, ancient and untouched, powering on for what might have been the first time in 100 years. Celeron pressed his palm against the activation plate, and the station's remaining power reserves surged toward a single dish buried deep in the hull, aimed at coordinates that had been locked in place since before either of us was born. "This is listening post Cavorn," Celparan said into the array, his voice steady even as the deck bucked under another impact. "Invoking Article 1 of the Ancestral Accord. We are under direct attack. Loss of station and civilian population centers is imminent. Requesting immediate aid." Silence answered him. Not even static, just an open channel screaming into the dark. The Skarn ships grew larger on the screen. I could see individual weapon batteries now, rotating, tracking, preparing to fire on us directly rather than simply passing overhead. My hands were shaking. I gripped the edge of my station to hide it, though I doubt it fooled anyone. "Sir, there's no response," I said. "Maybe the accord is void. Maybe no one has answered that channel in decades. Maybe there is no one left on the other end at all." "Maybe," Celeran agreed. "Prepare the evacuation pods regardless. If help does not come, we will not simply sit here and wait for the end." I moved to comply, my mind racing through every terrible outcome at once, when the console beside Celeran chimed. A single incoming transmission. No image, just text scrolling across the screen in characters our systems had to work to translate. Acknowledged. Coordinates locked. Hold position. 2 words that changed the rest of my life. "They heard us," I whispered. "Someone heard us," Celeran corrected. "We still do not know who, or what, is coming." The Skarn fleet opened fire, and the station rocked violently as our outer shields buckled under the first wave. I grabbed the edge of the console to keep from falling, watching damage reports flood in faster than I could read them. We were not going to survive 11 minutes. I was certain of that. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that whatever answered our call would likely arrive to find nothing but debris and silence. Then the sensors screamed a new alert, one that made every technician on the deck freeze in place. Something had entered the system, something enormous, and it had not been there a heartbeat before. I stared at the readings, certain there was an error, because nothing should have been able to cross that distance so quickly. But the shape on the screen was not an error. It was a fleet, and it was already accelerating toward the Skarn formation with a speed and a directness that made no tactical sense to anything I had been trained to understand. The Skarn commander clearly agreed, because for the first time since the attack began, their formation broke pattern. Ships that had been advancing on our position in a tight, disciplined line suddenly scattered, adjusting course, weapons swinging away from us and toward this new threat instead. "Identify them," Celeran said, though his voice had lost some of its command and gained something closer to disbelief. The system took a long moment to answer, cross-referencing signatures against a database that had clearly not been updated in far too long. Vessel classification unknown, cross-referencing archived treaty registry, match found, Terran Federation Defense Fleet. They had come. I remember standing there, staring at the screen, feeling something I could not name at the time. It was not quite relief, and it was not quite fear. It was the sensation of watching a door open onto a room you had spent your whole life being told to never enter, and finding that the room was already occupied, and whoever lived there was walking straight toward you with purpose. The Skarn fleet, which moments earlier had been utterly confident, began firing on the new arrivals in a pattern that told me their commanders were still trying to understand what they were facing. The human ships did not slow. They did not hesitate. They simply kept coming, absorbing hits that would have crippled anything in our own fleet, closing the distance with an intent that felt less like a rescue and more like a promise being kept. "Celeran," I said, unable to look away from the screen, "what have we just done?" He did not answer immediately. He was watching the same footage I was, watching ships that should have been overwhelmed instead pushing forward through fire, and I think in that moment he was asking himself the exact same question. "We asked for help," he finally said. "And it seems help has decided to answer with everything it has." The station shuddered one final time, not from an enemy strike, but from the shockwave of the first exchange of fire between the human fleet and the Skarn line, close enough now that we could feel it, even through our failing shields. I gripped the console and watched the battle unfold above us, and somewhere beneath my fear, a small and unfamiliar feeling began to grow. It was the beginning of something I did not yet have a word for. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe simply the realization that the story I had been told about humanity my entire life was about to be replaced by something I would witness with my own eyes. I did not know yet how right and how wrong those old stories had been. The battle above the station lasted only a few minutes, though it felt far longer while I was living through it. I watched the human fleet tear through the Skarn formation with a kind of controlled violence I had no framework for, and by the time the last enemy ship broke off and fled into the dark, the remaining Skarn vessels were retreating in a pattern that looked nothing like discipline. It looked like ships running from something they had not expected to meet. Celeron ordered immediate repairs to what remained of our systems, and within the hour a new transmission arrived, this time carrying an image along with the words. A woman's face filled the screen, her expression calm in a way that struck me as strange given everything that had just happened around her. She had short, dark hair, sharp eyes, and a uniform I did not recognize, simple and functional, rather than decorated the way our own officers' uniforms tended to be. Listening post Cavorn, this is Commander Grace Doyle of the Terran Federation vessel Ironclad, she said. We received your distress call. Your station has sustained heavy damage, but our scans show your hull is stable enough to hold, requesting permission to dock and assess the situation directly. Celeron glanced at me before answering, and I understood the question in his eyes even though he did not speak it aloud. We had just watched this species erase a threat that would have destroyed us within minutes, using tactics that left me deeply unsettled even as they saved my life. Now that same species was asking to walk through our doors. Permission granted, Celeron said, because in truth we had no other option, and because refusing the people who had just saved us seemed both foolish and deeply discourteous. I stood beside him at the airlock as the docking sequence completed, my hands clasped behind my back to keep them from shaking. When the doors finally opened, I do not know exactly what I expected, perhaps something closer to the Skarn, all sharp edges and aggression worn openly on the surface. What stepped through instead was a group of 6 humans in reinforced suits, weapons holstered rather than drawn, moving with a kind of relaxed alertness that seemed almost contradictory. Commander Doyle led them, and up close, she looked smaller than I had expected from the screen, though there was something in the way she carried herself that made the room feel like it belonged to her the moment she entered it. Commander Doyle, Celeron said, extending a formal greeting in the traditional Concord manner, palms open and raised. On behalf of Listening Post Cavorn, I thank you for your assistance. I confess we did not expect a response, let alone one that arrived so quickly. Doyle studied him for a moment, and then did something I did not expect. She smiled, small and genuine, and extended her own hand toward him, palm sideways rather than open. You called, she said simply. That's usually enough for us. Celeron hesitated, clearly unsure what to do with the gesture, until one of the humans behind Doyle, a younger man with an easy grin and a name tag reading Ethan Cross, stepped forward and gently demonstrated the handshake for him. Celeron completed it awkwardly, and I saw something flicker across his face that I recognized, because I felt it too. Surprise, mostly, that this small and simple gesture felt so entirely unlike anything I had been warned to expect. Your station took a beating, Doyle said, glancing around at the scorched panels and flickering lights. We can get engineers over here within the hour to help with repairs, if you'll let us. In the meantime, I need to understand the situation. Your distress call mentioned civilian population centers at risk. How many, and how close? I found myself answering before Celeron could, the words coming out faster than I intended. 6 colony worlds along this frontier, Commander. None of them are defended beyond basic planetary shielding. If the Skarn had broken through here, they would have reached the nearest world within 2 days. Doyle's expression did not change dramatically, but something in her eyes sharpened, and I understood in that moment that she had already begun calculating something far beyond simple relief at our survival. 6 worlds, she repeated, and how many ships does the Skarn Dominion have committed to this front? We do not know precisely, Celeron admitted. Our scouting has been limited. We believe it is a significant portion of their western fleet, perhaps preparing for a larger offensive. Doyle nodded slowly, then turned to the man beside her, a broad-shouldered officer with a quiet, watchful manner named Owen Blake. Get a full sensor sweep started. I want everything we can gather on their fleet composition and movement before we commit to anything further." "Commander," I said, unable to hold the question back any longer, "why did you come? Our people have kept your species at a distance for generations. We built treaties specifically to avoid contact. I do not understand why you would answer a call from people who have spent so long treating you as something to be feared." The room went quiet, and for a moment I worried I had spoken out of turn, that I had insulted her in some way I did not understand. But Doyle's expression softened instead, and when she answered, her voice was steady and without any trace of resentment. "You asked for help," she said. "That's the whole reason. It doesn't matter to us what came before, or what stories got told about us over the years. Somebody was in trouble and they called. We don't sit around debating old paperwork when people are dying. We just go." It was such a simple answer, and yet it unsettled me more than any complicated explanation could have. Everything I had been taught suggested that humans acted from aggression, from a hunger for conflict that needed only the smallest excuse to be unleashed. But the woman standing in front of me spoke as though the entire matter was obvious, as though helping strangers who called for it required no justification beyond the call itself. "There is something else you should understand," Selaran said carefully. "The Skarn Dominion has been expanding for decades. They do not negotiate. They do not offer terms. Every world they have taken has been absorbed entirely, its people either assimilated or eliminated. If you commit your forces here, you will be committing them to a war that has no simple resolution." Doyle looked at him for a long moment, and I saw something pass behind her eyes, some private calculation I could not read. "We've dealt with things like that before," she said finally. "Enemies who don't negotiate tend to understand exactly one thing, and that's a force they can't push past. We can be that force. But I'll be honest with you, it won't be gentle, and it won't be quick. If you're asking whether we're prepared to hold nothing back once we commit, the answer is yes." I felt a chill move through me at those words, not because they frightened me, though a part of me was frightened, but because of the certainty behind them. There was no doubt in her voice, no hesitation, only the calm confidence of someone stating a simple fact about the world. Over the following hours, more human ships arrived in the system, and I watched from the station's remaining viewports as they began establishing a defensive perimeter with an efficiency that left our own engineers murmuring quietly among themselves. Repair crews moved through our damaged sections, working alongside our own technicians, and I found myself standing near a young engineer named Lily Turner as she helped reroute power through a damaged conduit. "You're not what I expected," I admitted to her, watching her hands move quickly and precisely over the exposed wiring. She glanced up at me and smiled, wiping a smear of grease from her cheek with the back of her glove. "Let me guess, you expected us to come in shooting first and asking questions never." "Something like that," I admitted, feeling a strange embarrassment at hearing my own assumptions spoken back to me so plainly. "We get that a lot," she said, returning her attention to the conduit. "Truth is, most of us just want the same thing everybody else wants. We want the people we care about to be safe. We want to go home when the work is done. The difference is, when something threatens that, we don't really do half measures. Never have." I thought about that for a long while after she finished the repair and moved on to the next damaged section. It seemed to capture something essential about what I was witnessing. A species that approached both kindness and conflict with the same complete commitment, refusing to hold anything back in either direction. Later that evening, Selaran called a meeting with Commander Doyle and several of her senior officers to discuss the situation more formally. I was permitted to attend, largely because I had been the one to send the original distress call, and I sat quietly near the edge of the room as the two sides began mapping out what would come next. "Our scans confirm what you suspected," Blake reported, projecting a holographic display of the surrounding sectors above the central table. "The Skarn fleet that attacked this station was a probing force, testing your defenses before a larger push. We're picking up additional fleet movements roughly 2 days out, consistent with a full offensive. Then we have very little time," Selaran said, studying the display with visible concern. Our nearest reinforcements remain days away. If the Skarn commit their full force before then, this station and the worlds behind it will fall regardless of what aid you have already provided. Doyle studied the projection in silence for a long moment, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty I had noticed before, though now it was edged with something harder. "Then we don't wait for them to commit," she said. "We take the fight to them before they're ready to bring their full weight down on this station." The room went still. Celeron's expression shifted into something close to alarm. "Commander, that would mean engaging a fleet significantly larger than your own, on their terms, deep in contested territory. The risk to your forces would be substantial." "Risk is part of the job," Doyle said simply. "But sitting here waiting for them to finish preparing a force big enough to overwhelm us isn't a plan, it's a countdown. I'd rather hit them while they're still assembling than wait for them to hit us at full strength." I watched the exchange with a growing sense of disorientation. Everything about the conversation defied what I understood of strategic caution, and yet there was a logic to it that I could not entirely dismiss. Celeron clearly felt the same tension, torn between his instinct toward careful calculation and the undeniable fact that careful calculation had already failed to protect us once that day. "If you do this," Celeron said slowly, "you will be doing it without the support of any Concord fleet. We simply have nothing close enough to send." "We know," Doyle said. "We didn't come here expecting backup. We came here because you asked for help, and we intend to give it. Whatever happens next, that part doesn't change." I do not think I fully understood, in that moment, what those words truly meant. I would come to understand them far more completely in the hours that followed, when I stood on the observation deck of the Ironclad and watched the human fleet prepare to meet an enemy fleet that outnumbered them, not with hesitation, but with a grim and unwavering resolve that I had never witnessed in any species before. Whatever I had believed about humanity before that day was already beginning to crumble. What replaced it, I would soon discover, was far more complicated and far more remarkable than anything the old stories had prepared me for. Celeron allowed me to travel aboard the Ironclad as a Concord liaison, largely because someone needed to record what happened for the Council, and because I suspect he also wanted a set of eyes he trusted watching this unfamiliar ally from the inside. I did not sleep during the transit. I stood on the observation deck instead, watching the human fleet move into formation around us, and tried to steady the unease that had settled into my chest since the meeting. Commander Doyle found me there sometime before the final approach, standing with her hands clasped behind her back, studying the same starfield I had been watching. "You look like someone who hasn't slept in a while," she said. "I have not," I admitted. "I keep trying to understand what I am watching, and I cannot quite manage it." She was quiet for a moment before she answered. "You're allowed to be afraid. Most people are, before something like this. The ones who aren't afraid are usually the ones you need to worry about." "Are you afraid?" I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. Doyle considered it honestly, rather than brushing the question aside the way I half expected. "Every time," she said, "fear just isn't the thing that decides what I do next." Before I could respond, an alert chimed across the deck, and her expression shifted instantly into something focused and sharp. "Enemy fleet detected," came the report from the bridge. "Range, 400,000 kilometers and closing." The battle that followed remains, even now, the most vivid memory of my life, and I have spent a long time trying to find the right words to describe it honestly, without exaggeration and without diminishing what I saw. The Skarn fleet emerged from the dark in a formation built for overwhelming force, ship after ship sliding into position until the sensor display looked less like a battle plan and more like a wall being raised against us. Celeron's earlier warning echoed in my mind. We were outnumbered, badly, by an enemy that had never once shown mercy to anything standing in its path. Commander Doyle's voice carried across the bridge, calm and clear despite the numbers scrolling past on every screen. "All ships, hold formation until my mark. Let them commit first. I did not understand the strategy at first, watching the Skarn fleet accelerate toward us, while the human formation remained still, almost patient, weapons charged but silent. It felt, to my untrained eye, like watching someone stand calmly in the path of an avalanche. "They're testing our resolve," Blake explained quietly from beside me, noticing my confusion. "If we scatter now, they'll read that as weakness and press the advantage immediately. If we hold, they have to commit fully before they know what they're dealing with." The Skarn fleet closed the distance rapidly, opening fire the moment they crossed effective range. The human ships absorbed the first volley without breaking formation, shields flaring bright against the impacts, and I found myself gripping the railing beside me, hard enough that my knuckles ached. "Mark," Doyle said, her voice unchanged in tone despite the moment. What followed defied everything I understood about warfare. The human fleet did not retreat, did not maneuver to preserve distance, the way Concord Doctrine would have demanded. Instead, they surged forward directly into the heart of the Skarn formation, closing the range aggressively rather than avoiding it, weapons systems firing in patterns clearly designed for close engagement rather than the long, cautious exchanges I had studied in academy training. I watched one human vessel take a direct hit that should have crippled it, watched its shields collapse entirely under the impact, and rather than falling back for repairs, it pressed forward instead, weapons still firing, closing the distance to point-blank range against the ship that had struck it. The Skarn vessel, clearly unprepared for an opponent that refused to retreat even while wounded, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that hesitation proved fatal. The human ship's next volley tore through its weakened defenses entirely. "They do not retreat," I said quietly, unable to hide the disbelief in my voice. "Not when it matters," Doyle said, watching the display with an intensity that told me she was tracking every ship in the formation at once. "Retreating from a fight like this just gives them room to pick us apart at range. Staying close means their numbers stop mattering as much, because now it comes down to who wants it more." Thor, the battle stretched on, and I lost track of time entirely, absorbed completely in watching a kind of warfare I had never imagined possible. The human fleet fought with a ferocity that unsettled me deeply, and yet beneath that ferocity I began to notice something else, something more disciplined than the old reports had ever described. Every aggressive maneuver was calculated, every risk was taken with purpose. This was not chaos. It was controlled violence, applied with precision toward a single clear objective, which was ensuring that every ship under Skarn command regretted ever engaging us. A distress call crackled across the bridge, one of the smaller human vessels reporting critical damage and a hull breach on multiple decks. I watched Doyle's expression tighten, the first visible sign of strain I had seen from her since the battle began. "The Wanderer is compromised," Blake reported. "They've got wounded trapped on Deck 4, no way to reach the escape pods before that section loses atmosphere entirely." "Send a boarding team," Doyle said immediately. I turned to her, startled. "Commander, sending a team into an active battle to rescue a handful of crew members seems like an unnecessary risk, given everything else at stake." She looked at me directly, and there was no anger in her expression, only a kind of patient certainty that I would come to recognize as fundamentally, unshakably human. "We don't leave people behind," she said simply, "not while there's still a chance to get them out. That's not up for debate." I watched through the observation feed as a small team, led by the same soldier I had met earlier, Ethan Cross, boarded a shuttle and launched directly into the heart of the ongoing battle, weaving between wreckage and weapons fire toward the stricken vessel. Every instinct I possessed told me this was reckless beyond reason, that the mathematics of the situation did not favor such a decision, and yet I found myself holding my breath as the shuttle closed the distance, willing them to succeed despite every rational argument against it. They reached the Wanderer, and the feed cut to helmet cameras as the boarding team moved through the damaged corridors, sealing breaches as they went, working with a speed and coordination that spoke of extensive training and, more than that, a kind of shared understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. I watched them locate the trapped crew, watched them carry the wounded through failing corridors, while the ship shuddered around them from ongoing exchanges of fire outside. Cross's voice came through on an open channel, breathless but steady. All personnel accounted for, moving to evacuation now. The shuttle launched again just as the section they had been standing in lost structural integrity entirely, venting into space behind them. I exhaled a breath I had not realized I was holding, and beside me, Doyle allowed herself a brief, tight nod before returning her full attention to the wider battle. "That should not have been possible," I said quietly. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but possible and easy aren't the same thing. We just don't let easy decide what we're willing to try." The Skarn commander, whoever they were, seemed to reach a breaking point sometime after that exchange. I watched their formation begin to fracture, ships pulling back from the engagement in ones and twos, clearly attempting to disengage entirely rather than continue absorbing losses against an enemy that showed no sign of slowing. "They're breaking," Blake reported, a note of something close to triumph entering his voice for the first time. Doyle studied the retreating formation carefully before responding. "Let them go. We're not here to wipe out their fleet. We're here to protect that station and the worlds behind it. Chasing them into deeper Skarn territory isn't worth the risk." I found myself surprised again, this time by restraint rather than aggression, and I began to understand something I had not fully grasped before. The ferocity I had witnessed was not born from a desire for destruction for its own sake. It was a tool, applied with purpose, and withdrawn the moment its purpose had been served. The remaining Skarn ships retreated fully within minutes, vanishing back into the dark from which they had come, and the human fleet held its position rather than pursuing, weapons powering down gradually as the immediate threat passed. On the bridge, I watched officers exhale, watched shoulders that had been rigid with tension finally begin to relax, and I realized that despite everything I had witnessed, these were still people, capable of exhaustion and relief, just like anyone else. "Casualty report," Doyle said quietly, and something in her tone shifted, the sharp command edge softening into something heavier. The list that scrolled across the display was not long, not compared to the scale of the battle that had just concluded, but it was not empty either. Names of the wounded, and beneath them, a smaller list of those who had not survived. Doyle read through it in silence, and I watched her expression carefully, expecting perhaps satisfaction at a battle won, or simple relief that the losses had not been worse. What I saw instead was grief, plain and unguarded, held carefully in check but present nonetheless. "They knew what they were signing up for," Blake said quietly, clearly trying to offer some comfort. "Doesn't make it easier," Doyle replied, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a tired kind of honesty. "It never does. It's not supposed to." I stood there on the bridge, surrounded by the aftermath of a battle that should have ended in our defeat by every measure I understood, and I found myself utterly unable to reconcile the ferocity I had witnessed with the quiet sorrow now settling over the same people who had displayed it. They had fought without hesitation, without holding anything back, and now they mourned without hesitation either, the same complete commitment applied to an entirely different feeling. Celeron's voice crackled through on a secure channel from the station, requesting an update, and I listened as Doyle delivered her report with the same steady clarity she had shown throughout the entire engagement, informing him of the Skarn retreat, the condition of her fleet, the losses sustained in defense of a station and worlds that were not her own. "You held them," Celeron said, and I could hear the disbelief still lingering in his voice even through the static of the channel. "Against a fleet that outnumbered you significantly, you held them." "We held them," Doyle agreed. "This time. But Commander Thal, I don't think this is over. A fleet that size doesn't commit and retreat without consequences on their end. Whoever is running this offensive is going to want answers, and I doubt they're going to accept a loss quietly." I found myself agreeing with her assessment, though I wished I could dismiss it as unnecessary caution. Everything I understood about the Skarn Dominion suggested that a defeat like this one would not simply be absorbed and forgotten. It would demand a response, likely a far larger one, and I understood with a growing certainty that whatever had happened here was only the beginning of something much larger. As the fleet began the slow process of repairs and regrouping, I found myself standing near the medical bay, where the wounded from the Wanderer were being treated. I watched Lily Turner move between the injured with quiet efficiency, her earlier cheerful demeanor now replaced by focused concentration, and near the far wall, I saw a young medic sitting alone, her hands still trembling slightly, staring at nothing in particular. I did not know her name yet, though I would learn it soon enough, and something in her posture, in the exhaustion and grief written plainly across her face, told me that the battle I had just witnessed had cost far more than the casualty list alone could ever properly convey. I walked away from the medical bay that evening, carrying an entirely different understanding of the species I had been taught to fear my entire life. They were not simple. They were not easily explained by the old warnings passed down through generations of careful isolation. They were something far more complicated, capable of a ferocity that had shattered an enemy fleet within hours, and capable of a grief so quiet and so genuine that it left me questioning everything I thought I understood about strength. I did not yet know how much more I still had to learn, or how deeply this understanding would be tested in the days that followed, but standing there on that ship, surrounded by the aftermath of a battle that never should have gone the way it did, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever the Skarn Dominion had expected when they crossed into this territory, they had not expected this. And I suspected, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that this would not be the last time humanity's fury reshaped the outcome of a war that was never meant to include them at all. In the days following the battle, the ironclad remained anchored near the station while repair crews worked around the clock, and I found myself with more time than I expected to simply observe the people who had, against every prediction I had grown up believing, saved everything I cared about. Celeron had asked me to remain aboard as a liaison during this period, and though part of me wanted to return to the relative comfort of the station, a larger part of me understood that I had been given a rare opportunity to truly understand a species that the rest of the Concord still only knew through fear and old warnings. The young medic I had seen sitting alone in the medical bay was named Nora Ellison, and I learned her name properly a few days later, when I found her again in the same corner of the medical bay, this time mending a torn sleeve rather than tending to the wounded. She looked up when I approached, and though her expression remained tired, there was no hostility in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of my presence. "You were there," she said, before I could introduce myself. "During the battle, I remember seeing you on the bridge feed." "I was," I confirmed, taking a seat on the bench across from her, unsure exactly how to begin the conversation I wanted to have. "I saw you afterward as well. You looked as though the battle had cost you something the casualty reports could not measure." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands still working absently at the fabric in her lap. "There was a crewman from the Wanderer," she finally said. "Young, barely out of training. I worked on him for almost 20 minutes, before I had to accept there was nothing more I could do. I still keep thinking about what I might have done differently, even though I know, logically, that there wasn't anything." "I am sorry," I said, and I meant it fully, though the words felt insufficient for what she was describing. "Everyone keeps telling me it wasn't my fault," she continued, her voice quiet and a little rough. "And I know that's true, but knowing something is true and actually feeling it are two very different things." I sat with her in silence for a while, unsure what comfort I could possibly offer someone from a species so different from my own, and yet finding that the silence itself seemed to matter more than any words I might have chosen. "I do not understand something," I finally admitted. "During the battle, your people fought without hesitation, without holding anything back. I watched ships take damage that should have forced a retreat, and instead they pressed forward. And yet here you are, grieving so completely for a single loss among what could have been so many more. I do not understand how both of those things exist within the same people. Nora considered the question carefully before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a kind of tired wisdom that seemed far beyond her apparent years. I think people assume that because we fight hard, we must not care as much about the people we lose. But it's actually the opposite. We fight the way we do because we care so much that we can't stand the thought of losing more than we have to. Every ounce of that ferocity you saw, it's not because we don't value life. It's because we value it so much that we're willing to give everything to protect it. Her words settled into me slowly, reshaping something I had believed for as long as I could remember. I had grown up with stories that painted humans as violent by nature, as a species whose aggression existed simply for its own sake, disconnected from any deeper purpose. What Nora was describing was something entirely different, a fury born not from cruelty, but from an almost unbearable depth of care. Commander Doyle told me something similar, I said, when I asked her why your people answered our call at all, given how long we kept you isolated. She's right, Nora said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time since our conversation began. That's really all it comes down to, in the end. Somebody needed help, and we were able to give it. Doesn't matter what came before that moment. Later that day, I found myself speaking with Owen Blake in one of the ship's observation lounges, watching the ongoing repair work through the wide viewport. He was quieter than most of the crew I had encountered, more inclined toward careful observation than easy conversation, but he seemed willing enough to answer my questions when I asked them. I keep trying to reconcile what I witnessed during the battle with what I have witnessed since, I told him. The ferocity, and then the grief that followed it. I do not have a framework for understanding how those two things coexist so completely within your people. Blake considered this for a while, his eyes still fixed on the work being done outside. I think the mistake most outsiders make is assuming those two things are opposites, he said. Like caring about people and fighting hard for them can't both be true at the same time. But honestly, in my experience, the people who fight hardest are usually the ones who feel the most. It's not despite the caring, it's because of it. Your species built an entire reputation around aggression, I said. The old reports my people relied on for generations described you as unstable, dangerous, prone to conflict without sufficient cause. I have not seen that here. I have seen something else entirely. Blake finally turned to look at me directly, and there was something almost sad in his expression. We've made plenty of mistakes throughout our history. I won't pretend otherwise. There's truth buried somewhere in those old reports, even if it's twisted up with a lot that isn't fair. But most of what you're seeing here isn't aggression for its own sake. It's people trying to protect something they care about, in the only way they know how to do it fully. When the stakes are real, we don't do things halfway. That's just who we are. I thought about his words for a long while after our conversation ended, turning them over in my mind alongside everything else I had witnessed since sending that first desperate call for aid. The picture forming in my understanding was far more complicated than anything the old warnings had prepared me for. A species capable of both devastating ferocity and profound tenderness, often within the very same moment, applied not as contradictory impulses, but as two expressions of the same underlying trait. Commander Doyle found me in the observation lounge sometime later, and she settled into the seat beside me without ceremony, watching the repair work in silence for a while before speaking. "You've been talking to my crew," she said, not accusingly, simply as an observation. "I have," I admitted. "I find myself needing to understand something I did not expect to encounter. My entire life, I was taught that your species was dangerous, specifically because you did not value life the way we did. What I have witnessed since that battle suggests something entirely different." Doyle was quiet for a moment, considering her response carefully. "I won't pretend we're perfect," she said finally. "We've fought each other plenty throughout our history, made mistakes that cost more than they should have. But when it comes to protecting people, especially people who can't protect themselves, we don't hold back. Never have. I think somewhere along the way, whoever wrote those old reports about us saw the fighting and missed the reason behind it entirely. The reason being care, I said, echoing what both Nora and Blake had told me separately. The reason being care, Doyle agreed. Every single time. I asked her then about the losses from the battle, about the names on that casualty list she had read with such quiet grief, and she answered honestly, without deflecting the question the way I half expected. 6 people, she said, 6 people who won't be going home. I knew 2 of them personally, served with them for years. She paused, her jaw tightening slightly before she continued. It never gets easier, no matter how many times you go through it, and honestly, I hope it never does. The day it stops hurting is the day I stop deserving to lead people into situations like that one. Her words struck something deep within me, a recognition that the strength I had witnessed was not the absence of pain, but rather a willingness to carry that pain fully while continuing to act regardless. It was a kind of resilience I had not encountered before, not in my own people, and certainly not in the Skarn we had fought against. Over the following days, as repairs continued and the fleet slowly regrouped, I spent as much time as I could speaking with the human crew, gathering their stories, trying to understand more fully the species that had answered our desperate call and changed the course of a war we had been quietly losing for years. I heard stories of loss and sacrifice from crew members who had served together for years, stories of families waiting at home for their return, stories that painted a picture far more human, in every sense of the word, than anything the old Concord records had ever managed to capture. Celaran, too, spent time aboard the Ironclad during this period, and I watched his own understanding shift alongside mine, the careful caution he had carried since our first contact gradually softening into something closer to genuine respect. He spoke with Doyle at length about the broader situation, about the Skarn Dominion's likely response to their defeat, and about what continued cooperation between our peoples might look like moving forward. I fear this is far from over, Celaran told me one evening, as we stood together on the observation deck watching the stars beyond the damaged station. The Skarn will not simply accept this loss. They will return, likely with greater force, and we will need every advantage available to us if we hope to protect the world still under threat. Do you believe the humans will continue to help us? I asked him. Celaran considered the question carefully before answering. I believe, he said slowly, that we may have been wrong about them for a very long time, and I believe that correcting that mistake may be the only thing standing between our worlds and complete devastation. I did not yet know what the coming days would bring, whether the fragile alliance formed in the desperation of that first battle would hold against whatever the Skarn Dominion chose to send against us next. But I understood, with a clarity I had not possessed before that terrible morning when the alarms first tore me from my sleep, that everything I had once believed about humanity had been incomplete at best and dangerously wrong at worst. They were not the monsters the old reports described. They were something far more complicated, capable of a fury that could shatter an enemy fleet and a tenderness that could grieve a single loss as though it were an unbearable weight. And as I stood there beside Celaran, watching the stars and waiting for whatever came next, I understood that the story I would eventually tell about this war would need to capture both of those truths equally, or it would fail to capture the truth at all. Celaran's prediction proved correct within the week. Scout reports began filtering in from across the frontier, describing Skarn fleet movements on a scale we had not witnessed before, entire battle groups redirecting from other fronts to converge on our sector. Whatever pride or strategy had driven the Dominion's original assault, our unexpected victory had clearly wounded something deeper than territory. They were coming back, and this time they intended to make certain there would be no repeat of their earlier defeat. I stood on the bridge of the Ironclad when the first detailed reports arrived, watching Commander Doyle's expression grow increasingly focused as the scale of the approaching force became clear. It was not simply larger than the previous assault. It was several times larger, a force clearly assembled with the specific purpose of overwhelming any defense we could possibly mount, human or Concord alike. "They're not testing us anymore," Blake said quietly, studying the projected formation. "This is meant to end things decisively." Doyle studied the display in silence for a long moment before turning to address the gathered officers. "Then we make sure it doesn't end the way they're expecting," she said. "Get me a channel to Federation Command. If we're going to hold this line, we're going to need more than what we currently have." I watched with a growing sense of both hope and apprehension as additional human ships began arriving over the following days, summoned by requests that traveled far faster and reached far deeper into Terran territory than I had believed possible. Alongside them came something I had not expected at all: several Concord fleets that had finally managed to reposition, drawn not only by our original distress call, but by reports of the earlier battle that had spread through Concord channels far faster than official communications typically traveled. Celeron met with representatives from both fleets over the following days, coordinating a defense that would combine Concord numbers with human tactics in a way that neither side had ever attempted before. I watched officers from both sides struggle initially to understand each other's approaches, Concord commanders instinctively favoring caution and measured engagement, human officers pressing consistently for more aggressive, decisive action. It was Doyle, ultimately, who found a way to bridge the gap between the two philosophies. "Your people are good at holding ground and coordinating large formations," she told the assembled commanders during a joint strategy session I was permitted to observe. "We're good at breaking through when it matters most. Instead of trying to make everyone fight the same way, let's use what each side actually does best." The plan that emerged combined Concord defensive lines anchored around the station and the worlds behind it, with human strike forces positioned to counter any attempt by the Skarn fleet to break through at concentrated points. It was, Celeron admitted privately to me, a strategy neither species could have developed alone, built entirely from the uneasy but genuine cooperation that had grown between our peoples over the preceding weeks. The Skarn fleet arrived 9 days after the first warning reports, and the battle that followed dwarfed everything I had witnessed before. I will not attempt to describe every detail of those long hours, both because the scale defies simple description and because I have come to understand that dwelling too deeply on the violence of that day serves no purpose beyond the story itself. What I will say is that the combined fleet held, though the cost was heavy on both sides, and that somewhere in the final hours of that engagement, something shifted within the Skarn command structure that none of us had anticipated. Their fleet began to fracture, not simply retreating in the disciplined manner I had witnessed during the earlier battle, but scattering in a way that suggested internal disagreement rather than coordinated withdrawal. Celeron later learned, through channels I never fully understood, that the Skarn commander overseeing this offensive had lost the confidence of their own subordinates following the unprecedented losses sustained against a defense they had been assured would collapse easily. Within days of the battle's end, an unprecedented message arrived through official Concord diplomatic channels, one that Celeron read to me personally, his voice carrying a note of disbelief he made no effort to hide. "The Skarn Dominion is requesting formal negotiations," he said. "They wish to discuss terms for a ceasefire along this entire frontier." I stared at him, uncertain I had heard correctly. They have never negotiated before. Every previous conflict has ended only when one side was entirely destroyed or absorbed. "I am aware," Celeron said, which suggests that whatever confidence drove their expansion for all these years has been shaken more deeply than any of us realized possible. The negotiations that followed took place over several weeks, and though I was not present for the formal sessions, I followed their progress closely through Celeron's reports and through conversations with Doyle, who had been asked to remain present as a representative of the force that had fundamentally altered the balance of this conflict. The terms eventually agreed upon were far from perfect, leaving many difficult questions about territory and reparations unresolved, but they represented something the Concord had not achieved in generations of conflict with the Skarn Dominion, a genuine pause in hostilities born not from exhaustion alone, but from a demonstrated unwillingness to simply accept continued losses. During this period, the Concord Council convened an emergency session to discuss the broader implications of what had occurred, and Celeron was called to testify regarding the events at Listening Post Cavorn and the subsequent battles that followed. I was asked to accompany him, and though I had never expected to find myself standing before the full council, I understood that my first-hand account carried weight that second-hand reports could not fully capture. The session was tense from the beginning, with several council members expressing deep concern over the decision to invoke the old accord with humanity at all, arguing that the risks of closer contact outweighed whatever benefits had been gained in this particular instance. I listened to their arguments with a patience I did not entirely feel, understanding their caution even as I found myself increasingly frustrated by how completely it ignored everything I had personally witnessed. When my turn came to speak, I found myself abandoning the careful, measured language I had prepared, choosing instead to describe honestly what I had seen during those weeks aboard the Ironclad. I spoke of the battle itself, of ships pressing forward despite catastrophic damage, rather than retreating to preserve themselves. I spoke of the boarding team that had risked everything to save a handful of trapped crew members when the calculations clearly argued against the attempt. And I spoke, perhaps most importantly, of what I had witnessed afterward, the grief carried so completely by people who had just demonstrated such overwhelming ferocity, the quiet conversations with Nora Ellison and Owen Blake that had taught me more about humanity's true nature than any Academy report ever could. We were taught to fear them, I told the assembled council, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. We were taught that their willingness to fight without hesitation reflected an absence of value placed on life itself. What I witnessed suggests precisely the opposite. Their ferocity exists because they value life so completely that they refuse to accept its loss without giving everything possible to prevent it. I do not believe we have anything to fear from a species capable of that kind of care. I believe we have spent generations misunderstanding something that, properly understood, might represent one of the greatest allies our Concord has ever had the opportunity to know. The council deliberated for several days following the testimony, and I will admit, I did not expect the outcome that eventually emerged. By a narrow but genuine majority, the ancient quarantine restricting contact with humanity was formally lifted, replaced with a new framework for ongoing diplomatic and defensive cooperation between our peoples. It was not a perfect resolution, and many within the council remained cautious, insisting on careful oversight of any future interactions. But it represented a beginning, a genuine step away from the fear that had defined our relationship with humanity for as long as anyone could remember. I returned to Listening Post Cavorn some months later, once repairs had been fully completed and the station had resumed its ordinary function along the frontier. Celeron remained in command, though I noticed a change in him that I suspected mirrored something happening within me as well, a willingness to question old assumptions that had once seemed entirely settled. Commander Doyle visited the station shortly before her fleet was scheduled to return to Terran territory, and I met her one final time on the same observation deck where our first real conversation had taken place. I wanted to thank you, I told her, not simply for answering our call, but for everything that came after. For helping me understand something I do not believe I ever would have understood otherwise. Doyle smiled, and there was something warmer in it than the careful professionalism I remembered from our first meeting. You did most of that understanding yourself, she said. All we did was show up and be exactly who we are. The rest was on you, choosing to actually look at it clearly instead of falling back on old fears. What happens now? I asked her. Between our peoples, I mean. This cannot have been a simple, isolated event. Word of what happened here will spread. It already has, she admitted. We're already getting questions from other species out along the frontier, wondering exactly who answered your call so quickly, and why. I imagine it won't be long before more of the galaxy starts paying closer attention to us than they used to. I considered her words for a long moment, watching the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of everything that followed, that desperate morning when the alarms first tore me awake. "Are you concerned about that attention?" I asked. Doyle considered the question seriously before answering. "A little," she admitted. "Attention like that can bring good things and bad things in equal measure. But I'd rather be known for showing up when people need us than for staying hidden out of fear of what might happen if we don't. That's always been true, and I don't imagine it's going to change anytime soon." I stood with her in silence for a while longer, watching the stars, thinking about everything that had changed since that first terrified transmission I had sent into the dark, uncertain whether anyone would ever answer. I thought about Nora Ellison's quiet grief, about Owen Blake's careful wisdom, about the boarding team that had refused to leave anyone behind even when every calculation argued against the attempt. I thought about the strange, complicated truth I had discovered, buried beneath generations of fear and misunderstanding, a species capable of overwhelming fury and profound tenderness, often within the very same breath. The old stories had called them dangerous, and in a sense, they had not been entirely wrong. Humanity was dangerous, in the way that fire is dangerous, capable of both destruction and warmth, depending entirely on how it was approached and what it was asked to protect. What the old stories had failed to capture, what I understood now with a clarity that would stay with me for the rest of my life, was the reason behind that danger, the deep and unwavering care that drove every action, whether that action was tearing through an enemy fleet or sitting quietly beside a grieving colleague in the aftermath. They called for aid, and the Deathworlders answered, not with the mindless violence the old reports had warned against, but with a fury born from something far more powerful than mere aggression. They answered with a fury born from care, complete and unwavering, the kind that refuses to hold anything back once it has been given. And as word of what happened along our frontier continued to spread across the wider galaxy, I found myself wondering, with a mixture of hope and quiet unease, how many other species out there were only now beginning to understand exactly who and what humanity truly was. I suspected it would not be the last time the galaxy learned that lesson, and somewhere, deep within the part of me that had once been taught to fear the very name of humanity, I found myself genuinely grateful that it would not.